This event is co-sponsored by the Center for Contemporary South Asia and the Pembroke Center LGBTQIA+ Thinking Initiative and the South Asian Students Association. I should also mention I'm a graduate fellow in the Center for Contemporary South Asia, so I am affiliated with this. Aashish Kumar is a professor of television and immersive media in the Department of Radio, TV, Film at Hofstra. He is an award-winning documentary filmmaker and social action scholar whose work turns a spotlight on issues such as emerging democracies, social stigmas, globalization, migration, civic engagement, and grassroots advocacy. His films have been shown in domestic and international film festivals, used in grassroots community advocacy, and distributed to academic institutions such as Brown. Body Home World is an interactive web documentary on the South Asian American LGBTQ+ community, its complex and rich bond with family, colonial history, and other communities of color. And I should just mention that I am the composer and sound designer on this project. So here's Aashish.
Thank you, Ravi, and thank you all for taking time out. What I thought I would do today is talk a little bit about the context in which the subjects or the participants of the film exist in, and also talk about my participation in the project and how it began, and how I thought about it in the realm of what we refer to as interactive documentary, which is a somewhat new medium, even though the word new medium is a little bit like the grand opening signs. They've been out there far too long. And how my creativity around film and documentary evolved in the context of making something that I wanted to resonate with a certain audience. So today's presentation will be touching upon these issues, a little bit of the behind the scenes of the making of the project, but also a little bit about immigration, the evolving role of South Asian diaspora in the US, and its contemporary state, especially with regard to queer activism and queer storytelling. So a few words about me. Ravi has already introduced my affiliation in the academic world. I teach and I make documentary. I have worked in participatory media context with community organizations, and my work has ranged on issues that introduced me to a state of growing activism amongst the South Asian American community in the US in the last, I would say, 20 years or so. And much of what I have done has actually grown in response to and in conjunction with these different shifts in South Asian politics and South Asian political participation in the US. So I identify as a brown cishet male, and the identity piece is important in this context because when I started thinking about this project, it was from the perspective of someone that wasn't part of this identity group, but felt equally affected by it. And I wanted to articulate that sense through this project. And so to the extent that I have succeeded or not, it remains for you to judge. But the concern for me as a filmmaker was when I started looking at the issue of sexual and gender diversity in the South Asian diaspora in the US, what I discovered is that the burden of talking about these stories and these issues had, at least in 2010, which is when I was starting to think about this project, was the preserve of safe spaces in, whether it was Kush DC or Salga or Trikon. The larger advocacy community in the South Asian diaspora was not even coming close to these issues. And part of what my project was to introduce that conversation so that it becomes not just the burden of a few, but of the larger community as a whole. So the film or the interactive project, Body Home World, is an attempt to tell intergenerational narratives. And the reason I chose the interactive format was I wanted to make sure that equal space is given to narratives of families as much as to queer identifying participants in the project. I had done, as I mentioned, I've worked in linear documentary for many, many years. And if there are any amongst you who are familiar with the making of process, it's a process that drives you to creating arcs. And you have to have, even if you have a multi-character documentary that you're making, somehow they must fit together, they must interact, and they must have a narrative connectivity within each other. And I was a little bit afraid of going in this direction with this project, which is why the interactive format made a lot of sense to me. And when I share the project with you at the end of the presentation, I hope that some of these concerns, you will be able to identify why I have done it this way. So I'll start with this quote that really resonates with me for a variety of reasons. The relentless search for purity of origins is a voyage not of discovery, but of erasure. And this is a quote from Gayatri Gopinath's Impossible Desires, Queer Diasporas in South Asian Public Cultures. And I've done the lazy academic thing here of quoting somebody else in another book. So pardon that. The reason it resonates is twofold. Partly, it's the recent, and I would say in the last 4 or 5 years, this quest for, or this hearkening to a certain time of purity is a theme that I have seen or I've encountered both back in my home country, India, as well as in the US. So whether it's the search for a pure Hindu origin in India or a white national idea in the US, this quest, whether it articulates in the form of Make America Great Again, or a sort of a manufacturing of a greater India that existed with achievements unparalleled and so on and so forth in all realms. And I wanted to sort of talk about what erasures this kind of quest is actually going to uncover if you start going on this quest. And I want to start with a couple of examples, starting first with the very first known instance of interesting debate on the issue of race in the form of an early migrant from South Asia. So you may be familiar with this gentleman. His name is Bhagat Singh Thind. How many of you have heard his story, right? So Bhagat Singh Thind was a Sikh migrant who came to the US to study in California, and in due course of time submitted an application for citizenship. And he based the grounds for his citizenship on his Aryan race. Because at that time, the US in 1917 had limited migration to white identifying or descendants of African origin, right? So when he somehow through the district courts, he was able to get his application approved. But when it came to the naturalization process, they nullified his argument because of something very interesting. And I want you to read this quote. This is from the judgment that was delivered. It may be true that the blonde Scandinavian and the brown Hindu have a common ancestor in the dim reaches of antiquity, but the average man knows perfectly well that there are unmistakable and profound differences between them today. It was an interesting way of articulating the social construction of race. And I think the judge in this instance, without knowing what he was doing, he articulated exactly why race is a social construct. Because on the grounds of an ancestry, Bhagat Singh had an argument for admittance as a US citizen. However, his color, his skin color, and his Hindu culture, according to the judge, would limit him or inhibit him from assimilating in the same way that the European ancestors or the European originated immigrants would do. Bhagat Singh Thind went on to get citizenship, interestingly, from the state of New York, and had a successful academic career in the US. But thanks to this debate, the immigration from Asiatic countries was completely limited. And this is, again, a continuation of the Chinese Exclusion Act from 1882, continuing into the early part of the 20th century. So it isn't until 1965 that this is undone, this racist selection of who can be admitted into the US. And then in the 65 Act, we see a very selective group of South Asian or Indians who are admitted to the US. And I want to come back to that theme a little bit later. The second instance in the context of my film, I want to bring up this volume that was published in the year 2000, I think. Same-Sex Love in India by Ruth Vanita and Salim Kidwai, who unfortunately passed away. Salim Kidwai passed away a few months ago. And it was the first time where the queer storytelling from antiquity to the present day was documented in this scholarly way. And we, in this volume, we got to see for the first time what had been always acknowledged in the body of work, whether it's mythology, whether it's sculpture, whether it's art, whether it's folk tales, the imagery and the narratives of queer presence in India. So this is one aspect of the evolving history of queer storytelling, whether it's through academic participants, whether it's through immigration. And so that's one moment that I wanted to kind of mark. The third moment is a more contemporary state. So this is Alok. I'm sure you may have met them or seen them or heard of them. Alok is a gender non-conforming activist, poet, fashionista. They have many, many articulations of how they present themselves. And Alok is a moment of contemporary queer activism that encapsulates this very, very long reach that I'm trying to make in this presentation, that begins with Bhagat Singh Thind and is living and breathing in today's world. And my project is a living history which tries to capture these beats in the story of the participants of the film. So moving along. Also in the year 2000, Vijay Prasad's Karma of Brown Folk comes out. Also the first articulation of a highly self-aware and complex way of presenting the South Asian diaspora in the US. The term model minority becomes common usage after the publication of Karma of Brown Folk. And what does the term suggest? Model minority is a term used to isolate a certain achievement and a certain successful section of this immigrant population that is held up to as a possibility for other groups that are marginalized but cannot somehow seek their potential in the same way that the South Asian diaspora has. It's a very complex term. It undoes not only the project of a very diverse South Asian migration today, but it also pits it against other groups that it's trying to be solidary with, right? So it's a very interesting way in which South Asian migrants who prided themselves on their high education, their high median incomes, and so on, all of a sudden, it really made that a bit of a complex and more complicated undertaking for us to reflect on that, man. In the same year, I was commissioned by a South Asian advocacy group to make a project about hate crimes in the US. And the project involved capturing the history of racial discrimination against South Asian, starting with the 80s, the dot busters in New Jersey, bringing it up to speed to the contemporary era where hate crime laws had been put in place, but South Asians rarely took advantage of them. So this was a project that was aiming to inform the legal recourses for when racial discrimination does happen. And then 9/11 happened. So I remember we were rough cutting the film in September, and we were watching television, and everything changed. The the group that I was working with documented in the week following 9/11 542 instances of racial crimes against brown people, whether it's South Asian, Arab American, you name it. So the project changed very quickly, and it became an urgent, the shift in terms of the educational component was set aside in favor of responding to what was happening right there and then. For me, the project brought a certain kind of an education in that I met South Asian activists throughout the country. We traveled to Pittsburgh, we traveled to LA, we were in DC, we were in Maryland, meeting not only people who had been victims of hate crimes, from the most egregious, whether you were in a chair as a paraplegic because somebody in Pittsburgh went on a shooting spree, or you were a victim of a job discrimination lawsuit. I met people from the legal community, people from the advocacy community, whether it was South Asian Network, and it became clear to me that South Asians were no longer the way that the distillation of South Asian migration was no longer about the high income, the high median income, high educational attainment, but they were participating in a more full way in becoming vested in their rights and their status in American society. And of course, there was a long way to go. At the same time, we're starting to see this trend in telling South Asian narratives from a South Asian point of view, with a certain awakening of, or a certain education of political and racial justice issues, where we are attacking the model minority myth. We are looking at what narratives we are preferring not to talk about and addressing them finally. And we are looking to see if we can be part of this table where the rights-based struggles is happening, because we haven't been excluded from that. And how do we find a place in this space? And it starts with examining what we were and what we weren't telling stories about. And here are some of the examples of stories we weren't talking about. We weren't talking about caste. We weren't talking about race. We weren't talking about sexual and gender diversity. And we were definitely not, talking about marriage and divorce and mental illness. And this is a period of a certain kind of a shift in South Asian storytelling that I became part of, which saw these narratives being put out there. I was part of projects where immigrant and sexual and racial minorities, the way that they responded to stigmas within the community as well as bias from outside, both became salient issues, not just one or the other. You could talk about both at the same time. In 2010, my son was 10 years old, and I read a story about Tyler Clementi's I don't know if any of you remember Tyler Clementi's name, or does that ring a bell? So Tyler Clementi was a freshman student at Rutgers. And he roomed with a South Asian American student called Dharun Ravi. Tyler was gay. And one evening, he said, Dharun, can I have the room today because I'm expecting a date? Dharun set up a webcam in the room and live streamed the evening. He claims he didn't live stream it publicly, but he live streamed it amongst a few friends. Somehow or the other, Tyler became aware of that. And 2 days later, Tyler jumped off of George Washington Bridge and killed himself. When I read this, and there was a lot of press coverage implicating Dharun in this process, but also the conversations about Dharun's identity as a South Asian kept coming up. And as a South Asian myself, it made me think about, I try to imagine what kind of conversations were happening around Dharun when he was growing up. What was his living room like? What was his family? How were these conversations about sexual and gender diversity happening in their household? And I reached out to several groups that I had been working with in the South Asian diaspora, and I asked them the same question. I said, I know I worked with you on bias issues. I know I worked with you on these, on issues of building solidarity. But where in your agenda is the conversation about queer rights or queer identity happening? And we've come a long way since 2010, but if you were back in 2010, these conversations only were happening in spaces where the identity groups lived. So if you were part of a safe space in Salga or Kushtisi or Satrang or Masala, you were concerned about this, but the rest of the community went on without thinking that this was a conversation that they needed to have. The burden on the lack of images of South Asians in the media was another big pressure. So most communities, if you think about the shift that has happened in the US since the 80s to the present moment about gay rights, there's been a shift in terms of opinion mapping. Scholars have looked at the shift from about maybe 20-25% support to 80% support in the contemporary era. Most people think about that as a remarkable shift in issues around polarization. So they say, when there is a polarization, the needle never moves that much. But it did in this regard. And there are several reasons, and I'm not going to go into all of them, but one of them was the issue of representation. When it's a common scenario that societies work out their internal conflict either in the realm of fantasies or mythologies or through media representation. What is not present gets played out on the screen. This imagination, this space of contest and dialogue was completely unavailable to the South Asian diaspora as well. The internet was in its infancy. We didn't have the social media spaces that we have today. And there was no Mindy Kaling. There was no Aziz Ansari, or much as his name is now maligned. There was no presence of South Asians on the screen. So in this relative lack of image of people or representation, where would this dialogue take place? In 2015, I came across this article in The Guardian. It was published by a New York City journalist called Arun Venugopal. And its title was, "What Will People Say? Indian Americans Balance Family with LGBT Identity." And it was the first time, at least in my consciousness, that I had read accounts of people who were on camera, who were telling the story in person, whose faces were not blurred out, or who weren't lit from behind to preserve their identity, or who weren't using pseudonyms. One of them was Parag Mehta. When I read this article, I immediately called Arun. I reached out to him, and a few days later we had coffee, and he put me in touch with Parag and his family. And Parag and his father, Vijay Mehta, are one of the people that, one of the stories that I will be sharing with you today. It's a remarkable story, and I'm not going to give it away, but that began the process for me to connect with groups that I was absolutely delighted to find out that not only were there people out there who wanted to tell the story, but they had been telling the story already, just not in media, right? So that becomes the process of the idea of documenting stories of queer South Asian American community from the point of view of both the family members as well as people who identify as LGBTQ. The strands of story that I found repeated over and over again was that there was a process that was unique to both sides. So how do you capture that essence of the two sides in a traditional documentary, where oftentimes viewpoints cancel each other out, or you're forced to choose one over the other versus privileging each of them in their own space? So I wanted to do this in a way that gave each story its own unique space. And there were several reasons. I was making this project for families, and I was also making it for people who identify as queer. I wanted to give people the choice as to how they enter the story. If you decide, if you're a family member, And if you want to see other family members' stories who are in your situation, when you might be, you might lack the language to talk to your child if they've just come out to you, or you suspect something, or you have been told by another family member, and you cannot have the communication amongst your family, let alone pick up the phone and talk to somebody who's part of your family network. So this theme of isolation kept coming up in these conversations. So I wanted to create a portal which wouldn't restrict people from accessing it. It would be available to them in whatever form, on whatever screen they chose to, and wherever they were on their own time. And the only way that I thought it could be done is if I put all of these projects online. And I wanted to do that in a way that wouldn't just be a series of YouTube videos, but I wanted to contain them in a place that had meaning. And the creation of the space then became the quest for the next 5 years for me. So I began this project in 2015, and the launch of the first iteration of the project happened last year during the pandemic over Zoom. So as I said, I wanted to design an interactive space that was meaningful, it was memorable, and it resonated with the groups that I wanted to reach, which was the groups were dauntingly diverse, right? They spoke many languages, they worshiped many different kinds of gods, they identified with different iconographies, and they each identified under the rubric South Asian, much as a highly problematized category as it might be. So I had to come up with something that resonated with every single member of this community in a memorable way without singularly identifying with just one group, right? That was a challenge. So I started pouring through as much South Asian art as I could. I looked at clothing, I looked at fabric design, I looked at wall paintings, I looked at how people adorn their homes, whether it's in urban locations or in villages. I looked at folk drawings from kalamkari to fabric, embroidery, and pottery. And the distillation of all of this was meeting with an illustrator in New York who helped to essentialize some of these. And I hate using that word because essentializing always means reducing something. But the idea was to abstract from these design elements something that would be truly decolonial. And I think in my mind, I was convinced that if this project had to have meaning, I had to move away from design sensibilities that came out from the contemporary construct from where design takes place, right? Design is thought of as a Western, dominated space. And so how can design go to a place where iconographies, geometries, colors, they all derive from other texts, the texts that have predated the colonial identities that we were contesting in the present space. So here I'm going to present to you some mood boards that we started working with initially. And so this is one of the first iterations, of developing the iconography for the project. So looking at color palettes, looking at geometric shapes that derive from some of these art spaces, some of these sculptures and drawings that comprised part of the South Asian pre-colonial experience. Moving on from that, developing the iconography for the stories that I wanted to tell. So how do you present family? How do you present duality or fluidity? How do you come up with icons that can do that can represent at the same time have a level of abstraction that you cannot lock down to in terms of region or in terms of religion and so on. So these were my challenges, and some of my early drawings and sketches that my illustrator did. I hope you can see them emerge in the films that I share with you later on. These iconographies, these designs had to live in a space, and I struggled for a while before I came up with this idea of using a Tibetan mandala as a way of of basically containing these stories. The mandala resonated with me for several reasons, primarily because the essence of why the Tibetan Buddhists make a mandala is that it's a process of a transformative healing. In making the mandala and in chanting along with that, the monks are engaging in a form of transformative healing. And I always thought of stories as a way of doing that as well. And part of the magic of telling stories for me has been this invitation that it extends to the other for stepping into the shoe of the storyteller or the person who's on the screen. And this taking on of perspective can be a journey that can transform over a long term. I'm by no means am I over enamored by the power of the image. I understand that it has maybe even very limited aura, if you may, when you have seen something. But it's certainly something that that resonated with me in terms of the design for this project. And I started thinking of each of these stories as a sand particle that basically represented the universe of stories like this. And I always thought of these stories as belonging within the larger universe as opposed to having a uniqueness. So how can we have uniqueness at the same time belong to a larger universe? And the mandala captured that idea very, really well. From that point on, I began looking for somebody who could help articulate this in the web space. And then along came my magical artist. I met this creative coder, Ali Tanusar, who introduced 3D WebGL kind of styles of articulating what I was trying to say. And these are some of the early designs that he shared with me in terms of particle-based web work that was happening. And it's a very interesting space. WebGL or web graphic libraries are a way of rendering three-dimensional images using the graphic cards of computers. And they're so lightweight, they don't take a lot of intensive bandwidth, so they can be done in a relatively easier way online. So we were addressing issues of design, we were talking about issues of story, but we were also looking at how to make it lightweight so it travels easily. And it doesn't put a lot of strain on people's machines if you're looking at it on a cell phone or a tablet or a computer. So the third iteration became the creation of what eventually became the front end of the site. So I met this wonderful artist in Delhi, Ayman Naqvi, who actually had been working on Islamic mandalas. I didn't even know that they were Islamic mandalas. And such is the universality of the mandala imagery, like the cosmology, that you'll find it across cultures, right? The Navajos' sand paintings have them. The Celtic knots have them, right? This idea of cosmology is very, very widespread and obviously kind of reflects that the concern of all communities with seeing themselves as part of a larger whole, but also seeing the uniqueness of each of them. So these are some early sketches that Ayman sent from a sketch drawing to evolving to the eventual representation, which did become the website. I want to show you a few elements of the project, but before I do that, ultimately, the site tells short documentary stories, right? That was my aim from the beginning, that I wanted to have two strands of story. So I have a column that allows you to travel in the steps of somebody who is LGBT. I have a column that allows you to look at the same story from their family member's perspective. Each subject in the story, or each story pair, so for instance, if you think about Parag and his father as a story pair, their story consists of 5 episodes. 2 episodes are told from Parag's perspective, 2 from his father, and then there's a 5th episode, which is a convergent episode. So that's roughly the structure of the site. Each story is about 30 minutes long. Each episode is roughly 4 to 5 minutes long. So the idea was to make the stories short so that they can be watched incrementally on people's own time, but also keeping in mind the duration that is acceptable online, what people will sustain. So what I want to do is I want to show you I want to switch to the live website and then invite Ravi, who's been an amazing collaborator in terms of talking about the soundscape for the project, because that was something also very, very innovative in the way that sound can become not just the soundtrack of the documentary, but also the sound of the website. What kind of iterations can we come up with, and so on. So let me just switch to the, okay, how do we make this live? Podium PC? Can we dim the lights now?
Yes.
Thanks. So Body Home World can be accessed at bodyhomeworld.com, and this is the landing page. Is it from here? It's a bit low. Okay. So this is our, as you enter the story, you're introduced to the interface. There is a little information button that helps to explain how to navigate. As I mentioned, it's a three-dimensional WebGL design, mapping family journeys on one side and LGBTQ journeys on the other side. And each quadrant represents a story. And each quadrant has a unique tone. And this is something that Ravi can talk a little bit more about when he does his presentation. To enter a story, you click a quadrant.
Is that just coming out of your laptop right now?
No.
Oh, okay.
And you can see that the stories are mapped on each stage. So whether you are at the front end of the mandala, you're looking at the groupings, or at the individual level, you can switch from one perspective to another. To start a story, you click on the start button, and the 3 episodes for that story will play. You have the choice after watching the first story to stay on, or switch perspectives, or go to a completely different story if you so decided. There's also a more traditional menu, which allows you to navigate through the names of the individuals, and what else is there? So it's a very simple interface, but it's also an interface that kind of captures these ideas of how to represent using particle-based drawings or renderings that happen online, and also how to allow the user or the viewer to switch the storylines without necessarily blending them. In other words, occupying their own spaces or privileging each perspective in the way that the site is constructed. So whether you start on Vijay's end and watch all 3 episodes or 2 episodes from his perspective, or switch to Parag's perspective, is up to the user. So in other words, you are the one constructing a unique telling of the story in how you combine the stories and how many episodes of one you watch versus switching to the other one, and so on and so forth. So I want to end by just inviting Ravi to talk about his process of not only scoring the films which you will watch, but also thinking about a project like this with the brief that I gave him and the conversation that we had, which enriched my understanding, and I hope that it did his, in terms of what this project entails. So please join me in welcoming Ravi.
I guess I'll just sit here because it's nice and relaxed. I don't have any any sort of formal presentation, but I will talk a little bit about the role that music and sound play in this project. Because in some ways, in documentary work, music is very subtle and in the background, and you sometimes don't even know it's there. But it plays such an important role in framing things. It can really tell you where the director's coming from, what the agenda is, and that can be a good thing or a bad thing, and you have to tread very lightly as a composer. Um, so, um, so I'm half Indian. My father was from Chennai, and actually immigrated in the '60s. Right around '65. Um, and my sort of entrance into thinking about, I've been a musician my whole life. I grew up learning, piano and playing violin, but also getting dragged to Carnatic concerts with my parents and playing hangman with my brothers during the concerts and acting bored, but sitting there and listening. And in college, as an undergrad, I took a class in ethnomusicology, and it was right when my father passed away, and I had sort of gotten all of his old vinyl, which included a lot of like first pressings of Ravi Shankar, some of these really important records of the first recordings of Hindustani music to be widely distributed in the U.S. And I was also kind of in a big Beatles phase, and it was also the '90s when there was this real big scene in the UK called the Asian Underground, which was there were a lot of artists and DJs and bands that had South Asian identity. Their parents were from India or Pakistan, but they were growing up in the UK, and they were really playing with studio technology and sampling and exploring their ambivalence and mixedness as British Asians in this music, and I ended up doing a bunch of research and writing on this scene as an undergrad studying ethnomusicology, and it kind of started a lifelong interest in this as a research area, and now I'm back here doing more research on this and taking sitar lessons with Srinivas, who's here, and many colleagues from an amazing seminar last semester called Music and Identity are here, and I think a lot of my approach to the score is about music and identity, and the way I thought about this project was about the transnational aspect, the fact that parents and kids are maybe coming from different cultural approaches to the sounds that I could be using in the score, and in some ways, like slicing and dicing what could be a two-hour documentary into 5-minute, 10-minute films. Music is amazing as a tool to sort of thread these pieces together on a conceptual level, because you can write themes and you can then put them on different instruments. You could have a sound that happens on a sitar in one cue that happens on a guitar in another, and you can combine those sounds. So a lot of what I did with this was a very intuitive process, but taking a lot of my thinking of East and West and how Indian music and Western music have interacted in various spaces like rock and roll, New Age, thinking about all of these ideas in the score and using the score as a way to kind of tell through music some of these interactions between generations. So the only other thing I'll say is that one of the other sort of threads in the music that I'm interested in is the notion of the processed voice, because I think that there's something really productive and interesting about playing with gender and the sound of the voice, and there's a lot of interesting music that's doing that right now, and I think with the stories that are being told here, the processed voice changing the gender of the voice through technology could be an interesting, an interesting conceptual thread in the music. One of the most exciting things about working on this was actually being able to work on the website and the interaction sounds, and I wanted it to almost feel like something musical enough that you could play like an instrument, and each of the quadrants of the mandala have a different note, but the notes actually relate to each other in harmonic ways, like they form chords, and on one side you might hear a note with a synthesized instrument, on the other side you might hear that same note with an acoustic instrument. And I'm thinking about sort of older generations and newer generations through these tropes of acoustic and electronic, which are tropes, but powerful tropes that you can deploy as a composer. So listen for the processed voice in the soundscape. Listen for instruments that you might identify with India and how they might be presented in full fidelity, or maybe presented through some sort of processing that projects a distance to those sounds, and how those sounds kind of connect with certain characters in the stories. That's it.
Thanks, Ravi. So the last piece of presentation is a viewing of 5 episodes kind of together. It's a very untraditional way of presenting it, but it's probably the most functional way of doing it in a gathering. The current state of the website is we have 2 stories that are completed and 2 that are in the works. And so, story right now of a Maryland family, a Tamil Muslim family with a trans child, and the other story is that of a Sri Lankan. Sorry, that's the wrong quadrant. Dilo, a Sri Lankan trans actor, comic, wonderful human being who has made telling their story of their family part of their comedy act, and it's a wonderful way that they've created a narrative through humor. So let me switch to Parag and Vijay Mehta's story, and it'll play for roughly 30 minutes. And I'm just going to, at the end, we can